Yeah, the danger, the assumption in tech these days, as I see it, is that if venture capital and founders kind of get wind of what you're doing, they'll start their own company. They'll bring in a lot more money from VCs, and then eventually after an IPO, basically money from just selling shares on the public market, and that they can outcompete and outgrow you. So is that this kind of situation where they have to think about different approaches to growth? Or is it a situation where it's kind of a niche product where you can do very well and the VCs are going to kind of ignore you? I guess we'll see. Welcome to episode 22 of It's About Data. Your hosts are Matt Housley and Tony Baer. This week, we're talking about InterSystems, a privately held data company that you probably haven't heard of that powers some massive platforms, such as MyChart, that you probably have heard of. So Tony, welcome back. I think you were at another conference. Was it in Boston this last week?
Yes, it was in Boston. We had a nice cruise on Boston Harbor. It was actually an analyst summit from a company called InterSystems.
Which I didn't know much about before you mentioned them. And so it's kind of an interesting sort of bellwether for other parts of the data industry and interesting in its own right. So that's what we'll be talking about today.
Yeah, well, join the crowd because actually outside of basically the healthcare community or a few of the industries they cover, which include manufacturing and supply chain and retail, really not for most of their history, not particularly well known, but kind of interestingly, a classic bootstrapped company, kind of like in a certain way, very old school. But let's talk about that.
Yeah. And of course, what we're going to get to later is that you've probably heard of something called MyChart. This is very much like right now, a back-end company, but they're involved in a lot of very big products in the healthcare industry.
Well, when you're at my age, you interact with MyChart very frequently.
I interact with them too, but maybe not quite as much.
Yeah. Well, you're younger, healthier, and more vital. What can I say? I'm on my way down.
We'll see.
I just biked 150 miles last week.
Yeah, exactly.
We're going hiking in a couple days, so whatever.
Yeah.
But anyway, now InterSystems is an interesting company in a number of different ways. I mean, they really invented what we now know as the multi-model database. Originally, it was called object relational. Remember when we had that flirtation with object databases back in the 90s? I know you were in diapers back then, but
not quite.
Yeah. But fortuitously, we never, things like inheritance polymorphism, thank God. Oh my God. I would hate to think if we were still dealing with that. I think AI is bad. Try polymorphism and AI or inheritance in a database. But essentially it was, it originated, actually, there was a project around a unique language that was developed, I believe, at Mass General.
Okay.
Or with Mass General or with MIT. I forget which. We'll have to check the references when we get off, but called MUMPS. Very appropriate for a health, for a healthcare language.
Very appealing.
I guess they figured that, well, at least this, it would certainly be, the name would be catchy or memorable. And essentially, this company, did some consulting projects and developed a data platform, back around the 1990s, early 2000s, which at that time called Cache. I've heard various stories about how it got its name. Of course, Cache does use cache, but I have a feeling that the naming was probably, the origins are probably a lot more subjective than that. But that's the story for myths or whatever. And so, like, when the myth becomes reality, or myth becomes a legend, print the legend or something like that. But anyway, no, they built up a pretty steady following, with healthcare, with the forerunners of electronic health records. And so that's essentially how InterSystems really built its business, and built, as I said, bootstrap. Never asked for outside money, never asked for outside investment or anything like that. And according to what they say, it's like they've been consistently profitable every year. They're really classic, thrifty New Englanders.
Yes. And they don't have the intention, or they've expressed the intention to not ever change that model, as you were saying, which goes very much against the current right now with venture capital being so frankly dominant in our broader culture.
Yeah, other people's money. I mean, like, of which, of course, OpenAI is probably the poster child there.
Oh yes.
Um, but that being said, no, they actually have it written into the company charter that it will forever remain private. So that's very unique. Um, and the nice part of that is, well, gee, then you don't have to worry about having to satisfy Wall Street every quarter, and you can focus on your customer. But does that remind you of a couple other companies in our business? One of which is actually still on life support. Basically information builders, which of course is no longer. I mean, they exited a while ago. And SaaS, not SaaS as in software as a service, but the original SaaS.
Yeah.
And both of those were companies that were founded back in the 1970s and stayed very much private and did not really build any real succession plans, at least succession plans while the companies were still at their peak.
Right.
Of course, in the case of information builders, I know the founder Jerry Cohen never really had the desire to grow a real business. He was just happy to have the nice comfortable I think it was like a $300 million business that he had.
Yeah.
He was
Yeah.
very happy with that. And um, but of course, SaaS was for years considered to be the more successful counterpart.
Right.
But the challenge there was Dr. Goodnight did not know when to say good night, basically. And so there were a number of when SaaS was going strong about 10, 15 years ago. That's the time when they should have had a succession plan in place. And repeatedly, like the folks that we thought were basically in the running, kept leaving the company.
Yeah.
And so at this point, SaaS does have I mean, Dr. Goodnight finally in his 80s, and what's interesting, he is in the same age as Larry Ellison, but nowhere near the health of Ellison. They do have a plan.
Well, and I can tell you from my perspective, like watching adoption of software. Originally at the University of Utah, we saw this. So University of Utah was an all SaaS shop for students. In other words,
Right.
that's what they would teach statistics on. And then at
Right.
some point they switched to R. And then, in on the more corporate side, people increasingly switched to R and then later Python.
Right.
And the funny thing is that the drug industry, the pharmaceutical industry, was a holdout because the FDA required you basically to use SaaS. You had to use certified statistical software. And I heard from someone doing analytics for pharma that basically there was this rebellion brewing where some data scientists working for pharma companies said, we refuse to use SaaS. We're going to use Python. FDA, what are you going to do about it? And I haven't followed the rebellion since then. That was I think that was like 2 years ago. So maybe that'll be another episode to talk about the evolution of data science and statistical software.
Yes.
Like, is the FDA cracking down on that, or have they basically just kind of surrendered and said, all right, if you want to use that, you can use it?
Oh, gosh. Now we are going to be going into the weeds. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, let's come back.
I'll make sure to schedule a vacation when you get to that.
Okay.
But anyway, no. But I think what's really interesting with InterSystems is they really have, from a technology standpoint, they really have. They finally about 5 years ago did a major generational upgrade.
Yeah.
Actually, a change. Really, it's a major transition. And the original database cache required proprietary tools. You had to work, using InterSystems tools, and they had a version of SQL. It was basically a fairly constrained version of SQL, and then their own language. And transitioning to Iris, and Iris was a recognition that something just like you're talking about with developers that wanted to move from SAS to R and later Python. And Iris was essentially InterSystems statement of saying we basically we accept the fact that those who use our system want to basically use the modern tools, the modern languages, be connected, connect to like all the open source or frameworks out there, connect to open source and third party language models, et cetera, et cetera. So Iris was a total 180, and a credit to InterSystems is that much of their base has really has made that transition, and that's actually quite an accomplishment.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah. Because if you don't do that, you risk getting left behind, right? Like you have to
Exactly.
interoperate with open source software. Yeah.
Exactly. And so they've really made quite a shift there. And uh, what what they have now, it's very interesting. It's a very self-contained platform, and their whole emphasis is it's a common data plane. So that's kind of, I mean, that's essentially sort of the essentially saying this is our classic multi-model data, data plane. Uh, in other words, that you have different views that you can view the data in different ways, and that's actually a very modern type of idea. Um, and it's also something that we see very frequently in practice. I mean, like for instance, Google and Oracle really embrace that type of
Yeah.
approach. Microsoft with Cosmos DB embraces that approach, even though Cosmos DB is a lot more rigid in the way it does it in terms of once you declare the API, that's it. But the modern practice really is looking at the view of is treating data as you have a canonical storage format and you have different views, and you can pull that off in the cloud because, of course, memory is a lot cheaper, cache,
Right.
which
Right.
has cache, but also fast networks and the fact that you can separate storage from compute. Now, InterSystems, I should say, iOS does have a bit of a different, a different architecture. It's not your classic cloud native. Yes, they do separate it, but essentially you have all these different servers that attach to the storage. So it's a little different from your cloud native, and that's sort of a question I have for them in terms of where they want to take their market. Because I get it, because what they emphasize the fact that they basically provide extreme scale and they can provide extreme low latency, but it's done that way essentially through sharding the data and having these servers essentially address that the particular data. Because of course in healthcare, especially when you're working with clinical data,
Yeah.
you need to have that data updated in real time. I mean, like somebody's blood pressure monitor or pulse rate is going off the charts, or you have some monitors about sepsis. It's like you don't want to get that data an hour later.
And so this is like classic hybrid application where it's real time, but also look back analytics where you need to query a very small amount of data with very low latency, but also be able to look back across a huge amount of data, what we used to call
Right.
big data recently.
And this is something where I see InterSystems kind of going through a subtle change in focus, and I'm not clear how far that's going. Because when I initially engaged with the analyst community, when they first opened up to the analyst community a year ago, the context was that the analytics were really going to be more operational in nature. In other words, that you don't
Yeah.
want to bring down the performance of a real-time operational database with very complex analytics. Now, of course, in the modern cloud where you can do workload isolation, and if you have separation of data from compute, there are definitely ways you can get around that. But that being said, they have become much more ambitious. This year, not surprisingly, with analytics. I mean, at the time, I thought last year would they eventually do some sort of time with say like a Google BigQuery. At this point, I don't really see that.
Interesting.
It's not to say that that couldn't happen, but we really did not. It's something which I actually want to talk with them, more about, going
Yeah.
forward. But they do seem to be a lot more ambitious with analytics. But of course, also the elephant in the room, embedding AI into the platform and developing essentially a generative AI strategy where essentially you can use generative AI both to manage the database, to basically get answers from the database. So there definitely is a very strong focus on that. At this point, they have talked about Lakehouse. What's interesting is I think their strategy is tilting more, and we had this discussion a few
Yeah.
weeks ago, towards Duck Lake, because they feel that is a higher, more performant implementation than Iceberg. And this is where I see essentially the kind of the traditional approach of the company, basically, like we're a better mousetrap. It's the better mousetrap approach. And the thing is that, probably for their market, the way they've traditionally addressed it it may make sense, but I wonder how sustainable that is in the long run. As I said, we had a discussion with Duck Lake, and I see it very much
Yeah.
as a beta versus VHS type of thing in terms of, I think in many ways that train has left the station. But that's certainly, I think, sort of like one of the questions I have, for a future chapter, with InterSystems.
Yeah, and I'll be very curious to watch because I think as we discussed around that time, I think we discussed this with Ryan. It kind of
Yeah,
looked the same way with Hadoop a couple of years ago, right? It
yeah,
looked like Hadoop had completely won, and the different Hadoop ecosystem tools were going to take over, and there
true.
really wasn't going to be much competition. There'd be more evolution, and then all of a sudden, like Hadoop just kind of got wiped out by Spark and the cloud, and no one talks about it much anymore. It's still around. It's still deployed in various companies, but it's not an up and coming platform. It's shrinking.
Yeah, I don't think Hadoop ever had that type of dominance in terms of and like there was a lot of lip service to Hadoop, but
Yeah,
it was more
yeah,
like we will interface with it.
right.
Um, but it's Hadoop was still the domain of you really need to get under the covers to make it work well. I remember back in
Yeah,
the classic days, it was at a Cloud Era conference. We heard Target basically do a presentation, and these guys knew their stuff, and they were basically talking about how difficult this was.
yeah,
Um, and at this point, my sense is that I think we probably learned some lessons, with the open table formats, and
yeah,
also the fact that the open table formats are much lighter weight than Hadoop ever was. And the thing is that there's still a lot of optimizations that you can do over that. Now, of course, there's still arguments in terms of, and this is probably where the Duck Lake folks come in, is that, is scanning the only way that you can really, basically sort of brute force scanning, is that going to be the solution? But that's another discussion for another day.
yeah.
But anyway, I'm just saying it's interesting. The other thing what I would say with InterSystems, and I think it's going to be a very strong focus of theirs, and it already is it's really applications in the verticals that they address, and that's
Yes.
and the thing is that their business has traditionally been very very much white label. Especially as I said, if you're on my chart, that's InterSystems underneath. That's traditionally been the majority of their business. Uh, Through basically the applications, or I should say the solutions. It's probably a better term for the key verticals. And those being healthcare, obviously, financial services, retail and supply chain. That I see is driving more. Will be driving their business going forward. That said, though, I have to wonder, and it's more of an open question that I'd like to leave us with, is what does InterSystems want to be when it grows up?
Right.
And that's because, we had a couple of, there were a couple of customers that they had addressed the conference. They were very interesting case studies. But one of them was a very small healthcare system attached to a university that went beyond medical records to getting almost into customer experience. And they needed to have a lot
Interesting.
of detailed information about the student's lifestyle. And so this healthcare system, which dealt with 20,000 basically patients, a patient population, it's tiny in the grand scheme of things, and yet they had this very complicated system. We had another company which is more in the supply chain area that's running their own ERP system. And to me, those two customers were very interesting, but at the end, also kind of exceptions to the rule. And so I'm not sure what the message was there. It's just maybe just those are two customers that addressed our focus group, or whether this really or this really basically pertains to the fact that InterSystems is really dealing with, they're going to target primarily customers that have very specialized cases that need that extreme real time, that need that extreme scale, that need that extreme optimization. Because my open question to them is that, will you ever want to go to the longer tail of that base and go more towards basically a cloud native, let's say multi-tenant SaaS format?
Right.
Or will
Right.
that be, or will that, because look, there's a good argument to say, something, there's a small company, they're focused, and they've always done very well, working that way. And in terms of their aspirations, do they want to be all things to all people, or just be what they are to just certain very well defined segments of the market? And that can be a valid solution. It's the exception to the rule. just like basically remaining private is the exception to the rule. If you really have a handle on your business, you have a good succession plan, you have the right people in place, and you have that right, basically, I guess sort of a mind share with your customer base and that loyalty with your customer base, that speaks volumes.
Yeah, the danger, the assumption in tech these days, as I see it, is that if venture capital and founders kind of get wind of what you're doing, they'll start their own company. They'll bring in
Yes.
a lot more money from VCs, and then eventually after an IPO, basically money from just selling shares on the public market, and that they can outcompete and outgrow you. So is that this kind of situation where they have to think about different approaches to growth? Or is it a situation where it's kind of a niche product where you can do very well and the VCs are going to kind of ignore you? I guess we'll see.
Right now, I'm thinking it's more the latter, but
Yeah,
that's a topic for another day.
indeed, indeed.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you, Tony. And we'll talk again soon.
Great talking.